We're here today, of course, to discuss the abdication of Reza Shah and Britain's role in this. Reza Shah was one of a number of 20th century nationalist leaders and strongmen whose purpose was to modernize their countries and to end foreign domination and interference in their countries. A middle-ranking military officer, he seized power in 1921, and for the next 20 years, as commander of the army, prime minister, and eventually as king, he dominated and transformed Iran. His reign, his considerable achievements, and his shortcomings have been amply covered by other writers and is not the subject of my lecture today. My focus will be on the events that led in 1941 to his unexpected fall from power, on his abdication and exile from the country to which he had devoted himself. I will also briefly touch on a curious episode in which the British considered doing away with the Pahlavi dynasty altogether and replacing it. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Reza Shah declared Iran's neutrality. The reasons? He wanted to protect Iran against the ravages of the war. Iran had good trade relations with the countries on both sides of the conflict. He wanted to protect his ambitious economic projects from interruption. The Soviet Union provided the overland route through which goods passed between Iran and Europe. Britain was critical to the operations of the Iranian oil industry, which was the most important source of foreign exchange revenue. Germany supplied almost all of the machinery for Iran's industries and was the principal purchaser of Iranian raw materials. German technicians were essential for the installation of plant in projects around the country. And even when the war broke out, German machinery for many of these plants was still sitting in German ports or in Trieste, awaiting onward shipment to Iran on nuclear vessels. On neutral vessels. On the whole, Iranian neutrality suited both the powers on both sides of the conflict. Iran, as we have seen, provided a lucrative market for German industrial goods and a foothold in a part of the world dominated by Britain. Iran's oil was crucial to the British war effort, and England had no wish to push Reza Shah into the arms of the Germans. For these reasons, even under war conditions, the British went out of their way to supply Iran with the rails, locomotives, aircraft, and other crucial materials that he wished to purchase, and also to accommodate Iran in other areas. For Britain, the problem, the fly in the ointment, as it were, was the large German presence in Iran, especially in such strategic fields as the railways, communications, and broadcasting. The British feared that many Germans in Iran were collecting intelligence and constituted a potential fifth column. They feared possible sabotage of oil installations or communications lines, or an attempt to install a pro-German government in Tehran, as had almost happened in neighboring Iraq. Acting on instructions from his foreign secretary, Sir Reader Bullard, the British ambassador in Iran, repeatedly urged the Iranian government to reduce the number of Germans in the country. The Iranian government did take some steps in response to British urgings. They recalled to Tehran all Germans from the south to ease British concerns about possible sabotage of the oil fields. They sent a number of Germans home and kept close watch on the rest of the German community in Iran. They ensured that press reports were neutral and did not favor either side in the conflict. Yet these measures proved insufficient to allay British concerns. The British well understood why Reza Shah was reluctant to send more Germans home. The Iranians, some of the reasons we've already touched on. In addition, the Iranians believed the Germans would regard the large-scale expulsion of their nationals as a violation of Iranian neutrality and would react against Iran. Bullard, the ambassador, on one occasion reported home that he had argued for a full hour with the Iranian prime minister, but he reported about reducing the German presence. But he reported, I was unable to shake the prime minister. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of Russia in July 1941, dramatically altered Britain's calculus on Iran. British officials feared that German troops would break through Russian lines, and that once German forces swept through the Caucasus, Britain's position in Iran and her access to Iranian oil would be severely threatened. Moreover, the Soviet Union was now an ally, and the Russians proved even more concerned than the British over possible German fifth column activities along their long border with Iran. Within days of Operation Barbarossa, Britain and the Soviet Union presented parallel and very stiff notes to the Iranian government calling for the severe reduction of Germans in the country. However, by late August, Iran had failed adequately to satisfy Anglo-Soviet demands regarding the Germans. And despite the Anglo-Soviet focus on the German presence, far more important to the Allies, in my estimation, although they did not reveal this to the Iranians, was that access to Iran's overland routes to supply a hard-pressed Russia with war material and other goods became crucial to the war effort. The Allies recognized that use of this overland route through Iran was incompatible with Iranian neutrality. Thus, the die was cast. Russian and British forces crossed into Iran early on the morning of August 25, 1941, the Russians from the north and the British from the south and east, and rapidly occupied large parts of the country. Having occupied Iran, Britain and the Soviet Union needed control of communication routes and Iranian cooperation in facilitating the transport of goods through Iran from Iranian ports in the south to the Soviet Union. The Foreign Office at this stage displayed no wish or intention to unseat Reza Shah. On the contrary, when Bullard urged the Foreign Office to dissociate itself from Reza Shah, even to consider unseating him. The Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, replied, "I think our interests will best be served by continuing to deal with the Shah, at any rate for the present." This was also Prime Minister Churchill's view. I found in the British archives a personal note from Churchill to Eden after he had met with his foreign secretary shortly following the occupation of Iran. Churchill wrote, quote, "I was glad to gather from you last night that no attack on the person of the Shah is contemplated at present." Yet only 2 weeks later, Eden was seeking ways to bring about Reza Shah's fall from power. And we need now to consider the post-invasion events that led to the British decision to force Reza Shah from the throne. The role of the British ambassador in Tehran, Bullard's role, was crucial here, and I will take a minute to show why. When Bullard first presented his credentials to the Shah in January 1940, he wrote to the Foreign Office that he regarded it as one of his most urgent duties to convince the Iranian government that despite the war, Britain was doing its best to meet Iran's requirements in scarce materials. And in the year that followed, Bullard worked hard to accommodate the Shah in these and other crucial areas. However, by the end of his first year in Iran, Bullard's view of Reza Shah and Britain's relationship with the Iranian monarch had begun to alter. As he ages, he becomes more greedy, more arrogant and remote, and more unpopular, he wrote of the Shah early in 1941. Bullard called attention to the burden of indirect taxation on the poor, the scarcity of bread, the high cost of basic foods, and Reza Shah's propensity to amass property by pressuring owners to sell at what Bullard called ridiculously low prices. Above all, Bullard's view of Britain's relationship with Reza Shah was shaped by his growing belief that Iranians tended to see Reza Shah as a creature of the British, and that this close association in the Iranian mind between England and an unpopular monarch was highly detrimental to British interests. On this particular point, Bullard was much influenced by the views of his press attaché, Anne Lambton. Lambton spoke Persian fluently. She had traveled extensively in the country and had talked to Iranians of different classes. Her views, therefore, bore some weight. In a memorandum she wrote in the spring of 1941, that is, before the Allied invasion of Iran, Lambton concluded that the vast majority of Iranians so hated Reza Shah that they would welcome German intervention in Iran, and that to them, quote, "even the spread of war to Iran seems preferable to the continuation of the present regime." In his cover letter to the Foreign Office, dispatching Lambton's memorandum, Bullard endorsed Lambton's views and added, and I quote, "Public opinion in Iran is almost solidly against the Shah and almost as solidly persuaded that the Shah would not be on the throne were it not for the British." In his subsequent cables to the Foreign Office, Bullard continued to stress the damage identification with the Shah was doing to British standing in Iran. he urged his government to distance itself from the Shah. With the Anglo-Russian occupation of Iran imminent and then a reality, Bullard went even a step further, concluding that the retention of the Shah on the throne was detrimental to British interests and that he must be driven out. Bullard's views on Reza Shah's unpopularity registered with the Foreign Office, but his insistence that Reza Shah must go did not, at least not initially. In the third week of the occupation, however, three factors: Bullard's reporting, developments on the ground, and the exigencies of the war led to a change. Eden and the British government itself concluded that Reza Shah must go. Let us now consider how these three factors played out themselves. First, Bullard continued in cable after cable to the Foreign Office to hammer on the unpopularity of the Shah and the resulting unpopularity of the British because, he said, people believed that the Shah remained in power due to British support. Bullard wrote, I quote, "We really must show some sympathy with popular opinion in Persia, or the weight of hostility to us will clog all our efforts." Eden initially remained unconvinced. The British government, he cabled Bullard back, appreciated the risk of alienating Iranian goodwill by cooperating with the Shah and appearing to support his rule, but Eden added, I quote, "It is not clear that the time had come for concrete action, nor that it would be wise for His Majesty's government openly to turn against the Shah." Eventually, Eden agreed to act on one of Bullard's proposals. As a means of winning popular support for Britain in Iran, he first authorized the BBC's Persian language broadcasts from London and Delhi to promote the idea of constitutional government in Iran. And then, after some hesitation, he authorized the BBC to broadcast direct and escalating criticism of Reza Shah for the forcible acquisition of land, for suppressing the press and manipulating elections, for government oppression and the prevailing poverty, for personal enrichment at public expense, and much more. 3 days of intensive broadcasts followed. The materials for these broadcasts were prepared by the press attaché in Iran, Anne Lambton. The effect, according to one scholar, was devastating in its consequence. Lambton herself, not someone given to hyperbole, observed some time after the event, "Never, I suppose, has the BBC had such a success, for it was almost entirely due to the Persian broadcasts from London that it," meaning the abdication, "happened." Second, Bullard and the Foreign Office increasingly felt that the good intentions of the Iranian Prime Minister, Ali Foroughi, notwithstanding, Reza Shah was resisting and would continue to obstruct cooperation with the Allies. Under Allied pressure, Iran had agreed to shut down the German, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian embassies in Tehran and to round up and hand over to the British and the Soviets all German and Italian nationals except for diplomatic staff. But this work went very slowly, and the German ambassador was apparently continuing to conduct business from his embassy. The British concluded that Reza Shah was to blame and was working hand in hand with the Germans. The impression that Reza Shah would stand in the way of Allied aims was reinforced by a September 10 editorial in Etala'at, the country's most important newspaper and widely regarded as the organ of the state. The editorial regretted the violation of Iranian neutrality and the Allied occupation of Iran. It also regretted the shutting down, or the necessity of shutting down, the German embassy and that of its allies. The editorial went on to say that Iran would nevertheless maintain its own legations in these countries and continue diplomatic relations with them. Bullard was convinced that the editorial was inspired by the royal court, and it did serious damage to Reza Shah's standing with both the Soviets and the British. Third, there was the sheer scope and rapidly escalating Allied requirements from the Iranian government, which resulted in a significant rethinking of British policy on Iran and towards Reza Shah. Having occupied large parts of Iran, the British initially saw no need to enter the capital, Tehran, or to involve themselves in internal administration. However, once the full advantages of the complete control of Iran for the war effort became clear, British thinking changed dramatically. Within days of the occupation, the British chiefs of staff presented an extensive list of the facilities they required in Iran. These included control or right to full use and development of all naval bases, ports, airports, railways, roads, telegraphs, and other forms of communication, the right to establish air defense systems to defend the oil fields and Abadan refinery, and the right to place Allied personnel in key communication systems. Churchill, too, was already envisioning, with American help, a massive supply operation across Iran to the Soviet Union, and much more. 10 days after the Allied occupation, he had told Stalin that it was best if neither country entered Tehran because, he said, all we want is the through route. But only 6 days later, Churchill informed the war cabinet, and I quote, "Persia was now entirely in our hands. We must extend the scope of our original demands. We should have complete control of Persia during the war." Unusually, Churchill also dictated a personal message to Bullard, who he thought was not being firm enough. He informed Bullard that the facilities required by the military chiefs would be drastically interpreted, that to supply Russia, Iran's road and rail system would be developed at the utmost speed and at all costs, that large British forces and a powerful air force would be operating out of Iran in the following year, and that the Iranian government would have to give the Allies faithful and loyal support, as he put it, to avoid an occupation of the capital. Churchill added, and I will quote, "At the present time, we have not turned against the Shah, but unless good results are forthcoming, His misgovernment of his people would be brought into the account. Our requirements must somehow be met, and it ought to be possible for you to obtain all the facilities we require bit by using the possible leverage of a Russian occupation of Tehran. Within days, the Foreign Secretary Eden began to lay the grounds for the Allied occupation of the capital. He informed the War Cabinet on September 8th that given the difficulty of negotiating with the Iranian government and the unpopularity of the Shah, the Allies might have to enter Tehran sooner or later. With the Soviet ambassador in London, Ivan Maisky, Eden had agreed that an Allied advance into Tehran would take place on September 9, unless the Iranian government complied with a bunch of new Allied demands. If the Iranians refused, Eden told Maisky, then the march on Tehran would continue. If the Iranians complied, Eden added, then we should be compelled to find some fresh reason for doing so. This, I think, was a striking indication that for Eden, the occupation of the capital was now the lever to bring about Reza Shah's fall from power. Britain and Russia eventually agreed on a joint entry into the capital on September 16, allegedly to prevent anarchy. At the same time, the British began to consider the best way to rid themselves of Reza Shah. When he first alerted the War Cabinet to a possible entry into the capital on September 8, Eden also remarked, quote, that the best solution for us would be for the Shah to take flight when our forces drew near to Tehran. Discussing the same subject with Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, Eden told him that if the Allies entered Tehran as planned, it was my hope, Eden said, that the Shah would flee and disembarrass us accordingly. The two governments could then consult together about a successor, he told Maisky. The next day, Eden suggested to Maisky another solution to the Reza Shah problem. Perhaps, I'm quoting, perhaps the best solution of all would be if the Persian politicians were to invite us into Tehran in order to carry through a coup d'etat to get rid of the Shah, a view with which Maisky agreed. Following the incident over the Ettalat editorial, and after Maisky had observed that the sooner Reza Shah goes, the better, Bullard was authorized to discuss a successor to Reza Shah with the Iranian government. On September 15, Eden informed the War Cabinet that Russian and British forces would enter the capital the next day, and he added that if the Shah remained in the capital, quote, he would be under our control, and if he tried to leave Tehran to set up an independent government elsewhere in Iran, the Shah should be seized and held. The constitutional heir to the throne was Reza Shah's eldest son, Mohammad Reza, the crown prince. But the British now toyed with the idea of supporting someone other than the crown prince for the succession. The reasons were various and, to me, random. A chance remark by the crown prince had led Bullard erroneously to assume that Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, was pro-German, an idea that resonated and remained with the Foreign Office. Maisky and other diplomats involved had a low opinion of the crown prince's abilities. Bullard had attributed the damaging Ettalat editorial to the crown prince, leading several members of the Foreign Office to conclude that this rendered Mohammad Reza unsuitable to succeed his father. Eden had then cabled Bullard regarding the editorial. Quote, "This incursion into politics on the part of the Crown Prince obviously rules him out as a possible successor to the Shah." Finally, Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for the Government of India, had got it into his head that the British should get rid of the Pahlavi dynasty altogether, and that Prince Hassan Qajar, the younger brother of the last ruler of the Qajar dynasty, the very dynasty that Reza Shah had overthrown in 1925, would be a better king for England than Reza Shah or his successor. In the muddled British discussion over the succession, and given the doubts raised over the Crown Prince's suitability, even this improbable idea enjoyed a brief moment of serious consideration in England. Common sense prevailed, and the day was saved for the Crown Prince due to Prime Minister Fourouqi and his foreign minister, who spoke seriously to Bullard and also to Bullard himself. On September 15, on the eve of the Anglo-Soviet entry into Tehran, and with the expectation that the Shah would, as a result, go, Bullard urgently cabled Eden that the Crown Prince would be the best choice. "I see no better candidate for the throne at this time," he wrote. His reasons: the Crown Prince was the constitutional monarch, and he would have little power. A quick succession would avoid disturbances, and his accession would be accompanied by reforms. He noted that the Soviets were on board as well. Eden agreed 2 days later that the Crown Prince was acceptable, but only on trial and on condition of good behavior, and provided, as Bullard had suggested, that there would be extensive reforms, property illegally acquired by Reza Shah would be restored to the nation, and that Reza Shah would leave the country and take all his other sons with him. Reza Shah first considered abdicating on August 26, the morning after the Anglo-Soviet invasion. He told his cabinet that he was personally the object of Anglo-Soviet hostility, and he didn't want to be the cause of further misfortune for his country. His cabinet on this occasion dissuaded him, and perhaps he wished to be dissuaded. A month later, however, the situation had completely changed. The full extent of Allied control of Iran and what they would demand of the government became clear. Reza Shah was perhaps too proud to remain king in an occupied country. Most important, he must have sensed from his prime minister and from the BBC broadcasts that the Allies wanted him out, and that even his son's succession was at risk if he remained. On the morning of September 16, hearing of the Russian advance on Tehran, he summoned his prime minister, asked him to draw up the deed of abdication, and signed it. He left immediately for Isfahan, where he also signed all his vast properties to the state. He was no longer a free man. He was now in the hands of the British, who took charge of him. They would take him into exile and decide the place and conditions, first in Mauritius and then in Johannesburg. And they would hold him until his death 3 years later. In his memoir, The Camels Must Go, Sir Reader Bullard wrote that Reza Shah on his own elected to leave. I'm quoting, "The common story that Reza Shah was deposed by the Allies seems to be baseless," he wrote. But the weight of evidence and Bullard's own cables suggest otherwise. True, Reza Shah, given the situation, had decided in the end to abdicate, and sentiment in the country had turned against him. In his desire to maintain Iran's neutrality and Iran's links with Germany, Reza Shah perhaps failed to grasp the gravity of his situation once the Allies occupied Iran. But it was Bullard who for many months had made the case that association with Reza Shah was damaging to Britain's vital interests. Bullard, too, in language direct and indirect, repeatedly impressed on his government the desirability of getting rid of Reza Shah. Once the Allied occupied Iran, Eden looked ways, as we saw, to pressure Reza Shah to leave office through flight, a British-inspired coup, or the Shah's fear of the Russians. The government-directed BBC broadcasts were deliberately designed to bring pressure on the Shah and to stoke popular feelings against him. Bullard, in one of his dispatches, in fact, acknowledged the key role Britain played with local assistance in causing Reza Shah to abdicate. "We drove the Shah out," he said, "but change was effected very capably by the cabinet." Bullard's recommendations that the Shah should cede all his wealth and also leave the country and take all his sons with him were also realized. British officials knew with near certainty that Reza Shah would abdicate if Allied troops entered the capital. On September 16, the Allies did so, and Reza Shah, as foreseen, gave up his throne. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have several questions coming in for you from viewers, so I'll get right into it. One viewer writes, "Turkey was also a convenient supply route for Russia with pro-German sentiments. Why is it spared a similar treatment by the Allies?"
Well, I think, as I said, for the Allies, the use of the overland route through Iran to supply Russia became crucial once Hitler invaded Russia and Russia became an ally in the war. And the sea routes, the northern sea routes to Russia, were dangerous because of U-boats and anyway unnavigable because of frost in the winter. So Iran really became crucial. I think despite their emphasis on the German presence in Iran, which was a consideration, the Allies needed Iran, and Iran's neutrality stood in the way.
Thank you. Your book deals with this at more length, but a viewer asks, what do the British archives tell us about Reza Shah's wealth?
Well, not only the British archives, but material in Iran has revealed a great deal about that. And in fact, I have a chapter in my book about his wealth. It came from a number of sources. First of all, he acquired an enormous amount of land all over the country, but particularly in the north. And he did so by coercing owners to sell and also through confiscation. And by the time he left Iran, he was probably the largest landlord in the country. It's interesting, and as I mentioned in the lecture, he was, I suppose, coerced into handing over back all his wealth to his son before he left Iran. It's interesting that leaving for exile, he was very worried about his financial condition abroad, especially since he took a large number of members of his family with him. And he kept worrying his son to supply him with money during his exile.
Thank you. Viewers are thanking you for a fascinating presentation. One viewer says, how do you think this history contributed to Mohammad Reza Shah's insecurity and uncertainty in the face of the unrest of 1978 and 1979?
Well, I certainly think it was a factor. After all, Mohammad Reza Shah came to the throne at the age of 21, I think, with very little experience, following a very powerful, very decisive monarch, his father, and under Allied occupation. And during the war, the British and the Soviets didn't treat him terribly well. So in 1978, during the huge demonstrations and protests against his rule led by Ayatollah Khomeini, he may have sensed a repeat, and he even said to the British ambassador that we Iranians say, if you lift a mullah's beard, you will see the British flag underneath. So he may have imagined, I'm not sure, that once again the British and perhaps the Americans were behind these protests against him. But we must also remember he had been king by then for a great many years. He'd become very strong and powerful and decisive in his own right. So yes, maybe his experience in 1941 was a factor, but I don't think it was the main factor.
Thank you. A viewer is asking, do you know why Reza Shah in his final years sent many of his close supporters, ministers, the prime minister and so forth, to internal exile and had them killed, I think? Was it intelligence misinformation or personal fear?
Well, he had a very suspicious mind. And I think as he grew older and more autocratic and less in touch with public opinion, he grew more suspicious. And there were always, men around him, rivals, enemies of rivalries in the royal court who whispered in his ear. For example, Tash, his minister of court for many, many years, and perhaps after Reza Shah, the most powerful man in Iran, was no doubt brought down by rumors and Tash's rivals and enemies in Iran who wanted to see him weakened.
Thank you. Lots of questions coming in. Going back to the question of Reza Shah's wealth, a viewer asks, did Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi inherit all of Reza Shah's wealth?
Well, he did inherit all of it, but it was to be used for the good of the people. And in fact, the Shah donated a great part of it to various government projects and schools and that kind of thing. In fact, in my book, I quote Bullard as saying that the young Shah, was in need of money because he had given away or spent uselessly the wealth he had inherited. So he didn't stay with the young Shah for long.
Thank you. A few questions about the role of the BBC. One viewer asks if you could please comment further about the alignment of BBC with the policies of the British government at different times. What you said about the BBC brings to mind the role that the BBC played in the 1953 coup. And a second question, a viewer asks, as a former journalist and commentator, in your opinion, what is the fascination of Iranian people with the BBC, and how many times can a nation be deceived by the same source?
A complicated question. Well, in 1941, as I mentioned in my lecture, clearly the BBC attacks and criticism of Reza Shah clearly had an impact. But this was a decision taken by the British government. In other words, in 1941, the BBC broadcasts against Reza Shah reflected British government policy. I don't think this was the case in 1978. In 1978, the British government certainly did not wish the Shah to go. But by then, the BBC had achieved enough independence that journalists on the BBC became a big focal point for reports on demonstrations, on protests, so forth. And sure, they became a source of news for many, many Iranians. Our listeners also asked about the Iranian fascination with the BBC. Well, there's always this belief among Iranians that the British control everything and are responsible for everything. Certainly this idea was widespread in my father's generation. And some of that remained and remains perhaps today. But it was also a very good source of news. I remember during the war, my family came to Iran. I was born in Iran, but came to Iran from Baghdad. And I remember during the war, we had a big radio transmitter, and all his friends would join in our house to hear news on the BBC about the progress of the war and the fear, of course, that the Germans were getting closer to Iran and might invade Iran. And it remains today a very good source of news. And if you have a government that controls and suppresses the news, then people look for reliable foreign sources, the BBC, the Voice of America, other sources like that.
Thank you. How reliable was British information regarding Reza Shah's unpopularity? Was it merely unpopularity with the upper classes, or was it across the board? What did the British base this information on prior to the BBC's campaign to incite further popularity?
It's a very good question, and I think it's hard to answer. I mean, certainly by the end of his reign, Reza Shah was no longer as popular as he had once been, partly because of economic conditions, partly because of the weight of taxation, especially on the peasantry and on the peasantry. Whether the unpopularity was to the extent that Anne Lambton in her important memorandum indicated, I really am not sure, and cannot say. But certainly, the idea that Reza Shah was unpopular and therefore England was unpopular as a result, as we saw, played a very important role in the decision to unseat Reza Shah.
Thank you. What do you think of how today's Iranians, young and old, perceive Reza Shah and Iran's recent modern history? And then a similar question, maybe, a viewer asks, having studied Reza Shah so thoroughly, what is your personal impression of him? A patriot, a nationalist, a strongman, or a weak despot?
The first part of the question, sorry, repeated.
Sure. What do you think of how today's Iranians, young and old, perceive Reza Shah and Iran's recent modern history?
Well, it's very interesting that now, after 40 years and more of the Islamic Republic, Reza Shah has once again become popular in Iran and a source of some admiration. I mean, looking back for Iranians at a time when Iran was strong, independent, and of course, Reza Shah took a great many steps to reduce the power of the clergy in Iran. He's remembered for that as well. And it was a period of reform, of recovery, of a very weak, at the time, country. So yes, I mean, in recent protest demonstrations in Iran, people shouted, Reza Shah, may God rest his soul in peace. So yes, once again, to the horror of the mullahs, that the Pahlavi dynasty, who they unseated and tried to denigrate, has become popular once again.
Thank you. Two similar questions. One viewer writes, was Muhammad Ali Foroughi on Reza Shah's side, or was he welcoming to the abdication of the Shah? And another viewer writes, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I would appreciate it if you could explain the crucial role that apparently Foroughi played in securing Mohammad Reza Shah's accession to the throne.
On Foroughi, he was certainly a faithful public servant, and he served not only Reza Shah, but his son well. It is quite possible that, as Bullard reported, by 1941, Foroughi and other ministers had begun to feel that Reza Shah was a problem because he had become such an autocrat and so impossible to please. But it seems to me the evidence is that Foroughi and his foreign secretary, his foreign minister, really saved the crown for the Pahlavis. When Bullard reported to Eden that he thought allowing the crown prince to succeed Reza Shah was the best solution, he was reflecting opinion he had heard and urgings from Foroughi and his foreign minister.
Thank you. A question about Reza Shah in exile. How was he treated by the British? And can you touch on the circumstances that led him to be transferred to Mauritius? Why Mauritius? Why did he stay there for a short period only? And did he have a rather isolated, lonely life there, or was he surrounded by members of his family?
Well, when Reza Shah abdicated, he believed he had the understanding that he could choose his own place of exile. And he was disappointed and surprised when he learned on his way to pass through India, not to stay, but to pass through, that he would be taken to Mauritius. Mauritius was chosen because it was an island, it was distant from anywhere else, and they didn't want Reza Shah certainly anywhere near Iran, or as they feared continuously during his exile, that he could be used by other governments against the British. As to how they treated him, well, I mean, physically they treated him well. They found housing for him. They agreed, at least in Mauritius, to cover his expenses, having taken him into exile. But he was under British control. I mean, they decided his place of exile. They decided who could visit him, even members of his own family. They censored his mail. And this remained the case both in Mauritius and Johannesburg. But Reza Shah hated Mauritius. It was an island. It was, in the middle of nowhere. He didn't like the sea air, as he said again and again. He was a mountain man and longed for the mountain air of his native country. So after a period in Mauritius, the British finally agreed to allow him to transfer to Johannesburg. And the South Africans agreed to allow him to stay.
Thank you. What role, if any, did religious leaders in Iran play in Reza Shah's departure?
I think very little. Really, they had nothing to do with Reza Shah's departure.
And can you comment on the alleged popularity of Germany and Hitler among Iranians at the time within different areas of society, the masses, the intellectuals, or even Reza Shah himself?
Well, I think to talk about Reza Shah first, after his abdication, it became common to assert that he was pro-German and even an admirer of the Nazis. I don't think there's any evidence to bear that out. On the contrary, even Bullard reported to the Foreign Office that he believed that Reza Shah was avoiding siding with either side among the belligerents, but if his true preferences were to be known, he'd be on the British side. But of course, Germany was admired in Iran at the time as a successful industrial power, as the source of advanced industry and machinery and the like. And Germany had become Iran's largest trading partner before Reza Shah's abdication.
Thank you. We have so many more questions and comments that we don't have time to get to. Thank you for a fascinating conversation. A reminder that Professor Bakhash's book, The Fall of Reza Shah, is available through Bloomsbury. There's a link in our chat. Thank you, Professor. We hope you stay safe and well, and hopefully we'll see you at Stanford in the near future.
Thank you, and thank you to all our audience. Bye-bye.
Bye.